Hey everybody, Chris here from It's Mead Made. So today I want to talk to you guys about thinning your paints for airbrush. Now this can be a real pain, especially for beginners. Getting your paint too thick, it can clog your airbrush. If it's too thin, you can get spatters and drips and all this other nasty stuff. So how do you get that perfect Goldilocks paint thickness without going absolutely insane? When I first got into airbrushing my models, paint thinning was the most frustrating thing I had to deal with. I couldn't get it right for the life of me, because I was even reading forums, listening to what other artists do. I wrecked so many good projects, I was ready to take my airbrush and just chuck it out the window and never look back. So, I'm here today to tell you about all of my mistakes I made to help you prevent that same fate. Plus, I'm going to share another issue that can happen while airbrushing that could make you think that your paints aren't thin enough or you don't even have the right PSI. So, let's go ahead and get into this video. Alright, so this first mistake is one that can absolutely make or break the finish of your projects. Getting this wrong can wreck your paint jobs, and it's honestly a simple solution. And what am I talking about? Using the wrong thinner. I know it might be tempting to just grab whatever's lying around, maybe some water, alcohol, or even household cleaners. But let me tell you, that is a recipe for disaster. Using the wrong thinner can lead to all sorts of problems. Your paint might not stick properly to your model. You could end up with some weird grainy finish, and trust me, it's just not a good look. So different types of paint need different types of thinners. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. You've got acrylic paints that need acrylic thinners. You've got enamel paints that need enamel thinners. If you're starting to mix these up, you're asking for trouble. Your paint might not mix properly, and when you start spraying, oh man, you could see clumps, streaks, generally uneven finishes, and clogging your airbrush. Me personally, I like to keep it super simple and budget friendly by using just regular craft hobby paints, and I thin them with distilled water. I know I get some pushback from you guys that I use these cheap craft paints instead of using the expensive airbrush paints, but I like to keep money in my pocket these days. I don't know about you. For me, both the paint and the water are easy to access, and I don't have to worry about mixing a 3-part concoction or whatever it is as my thinner. Now, I'm not a paint chemistry expert by any means, but I did have a very enlightening interview with somebody that knew their stuff when it comes to paint chemistry. It was confirmed using distilled water to thin acrylic paints is acceptable and even more preferable to other methods. Well, Chris, what about using isopropyl alcohol? I've seen others use it. I'm glad you asked because I had the same question. I was surprised to learn that while it is a popular way artists like to thin their paint, that it's not recommended as it causes a chemical reaction and starts to break down your paints. I'll leave a link to this informative interview below, and I'll put it up here for you if you want to dive deeper into this topic. So what if you're not using cheap craft paints like I am and have no idea what thinner to use with your specific paints? What do you do then? The best move is to use the thinner that the paint manufacturer recommends. Sometimes it's on their bottle, and sometimes you just gotta go to their website. This is always my recommendation because the paint manufacturers actually know their stuff. They've already figured this out and they know what works best with their paint. Trust me, it can make a huge difference of how your work actually turns out. Now, this next painting thinning mistake is very common, and I get questions about this all the time. And it's, Chris, I use water to thin my acrylic paints, like you said, but now I'm having tons of problems. And my follow-up question every single time is, what kind of water did you use? And unfortunately, like 90% of the time, it's, well, I just got water from the tap, or a bottle of water. Using tap water or bottled water as a thinner seems like a quick and easy solution, but let me tell you, it can cause more harm than good. Tap water is full of stuff like minerals, chlorine, and other chemicals that can really mess with your paint's performance. And not to mention, if you have a well, There's all kinds of other things that can go wrong. But these impurities can lead to all sorts of issues. For example, minerals like calcium and magnesium. They can react with your paint, causing it to thicken or form clumps, which means clogs. And another thing in tap water is chlorine. It can really mess with your paint's chemistry, leading to inconsistent drying times and an uneven finish. Even those little tiny particles in the water can clog up your airbrush and give you a sputtering effect, uneven spray, and honestly just clog it. And that's definitely not what you want. At least, that's not what I want. So what should you use instead? For acrylic paints, just go with distilled water. It's free from all of those impurities, and it won't mess with your paint's consistency or its performance. You'll get a smoother and more reliable finish. Plus, it's cheap and way easy to find. Just go to a grocery store or a gas station and you can get some water. So I wish this next mistake wasn't so frequently taught by experienced airbrush artists, but I see it in tutorials all the time. You read in the comments and the beginners are wondering why they can't get it right. And that is mixing your paint directly into the color cup of your airbrush. Now, if you're a beginner, don't even attempt this. Mix your paint in a separate container, preferably a clear one, so you can see how you're mixing it. I use just these little clear shot glasses. If you don't mix your paint and your thinner well enough, you're setting yourself up for trouble. You could end up with an uneven consistency that will make your paint just flow poorly through your airbrush. Think about it like this. When you're baking a cake, you wouldn't just half mix the ingredients and then throw it in the oven, right? So it's the same thing when it comes to your paint. You want to make sure everything is well combined to get the best results possible. So just take your time mixing your paints. Use a stir stick. I personally like to use steel stir sticks. That way I can wash them and keep using them over and over. But all you want to do is you want to stir it until you don't see any streaks or clumps. It might take a minute or two, but trust me, it's worth it because you're going to get a very smooth application if everything is mixed properly. Now, over time, when you get more experience, you can take the shortcut and mix it directly into your color cup. But if you're new to airbrushing and mixing paint, stick with a separate container to mix all of your paint. So now let's talk about viscosity. Now, this is a big one here. So you want to make sure that you get the right consistency. This is crucial to be able to get a smooth airbrushing experience. So you've probably heard from other people, make sure you have your paint thinned to the right consistency. Or my personal favorite, make sure your paint is the consistency of skim milk. Because we all keep that on hand right beside our airbrush booth. Honestly though, what does that even mean? What is the right consistency? If it's too thick, it'll clog your airbrush. If it's too thin, it'll run all over the place and you're just not going to get a proper coverage. But here's the thing, comparing it to milk, to me at least, is confusing. It's hard to know if you got it just right by eyeballing it. I don't know if you keep a glass of milk in your paint and kind of like, oh yeah, there it is. So I just talked about why you want to mix it thoroughly. The real reason to mixing your paints properly is to achieve the right viscosity. That's where my PSI Range Finder tool comes in handy. This takes all of the guesswork out of getting the right viscosity. It helps you figure out the proper thickness of your paint and the right PSI for your airbrush. Trust me, it's a game changer for getting the smooth, consistent sprays you're looking for. Now the next one is a big one, especially if you are using cheap craft paints like I do. But it's also a good idea to get in the practice of this no matter what paints you're using. And that's straining your paints. Not doing this can cause a lot of headaches. Even if you mix your paints really well, there can still be little clumps and dried bits that sneak into your airbrush. These tiny particles can clog things up, and they can lead to sputtering, uneven spray patterns, and outright clogs of your airbrush. Are you starting to see all of these same issues if we don't do all of these simple little steps? So just strain your paints. It's a simple way that can save you a lot of headache. All you have to use is a fine mesh strainer. I use a little steel one that I can just keep washing, or you can buy some paint straining funnels to filter out any clumps and debris. It's a small step, but trust me, it makes a huge difference in the quality of your airbrushing. Now, this next one goes hand in hand with viscosity and is a step that often takes the most guesswork for newbies, and that is your PSI. So getting the right air pressure settings for your airbrush is crucial. But there's a lot of advice out there that make it seem like it's an all-in-one, set it and forget it type thing. But if your PSI is too high, you can get a lot of spattering and oversprays. But if it's too low, you might not atomize your paint properly, and it can lead to uneven applications and kind of like some speckling effects. The truth is that the air pressure setting on your compressor should match the thinned paint's viscosity. This ties back to what we talked about with the paint consistency and a thorough mixing. Even with perfect PSI settings, you will have a bad spray pattern. The right PSI helps ensure that the paint flows smoothly through your airbrush to give you the right amount of control to have a nice clean finish. A good rule of thumb is to start with a lower PSI and gradually increase until you've got the perfect smooth spray pattern. I typically start somewhere between 15 and 30 PSI. That works well for most airbrushes, depending on the types of paint that you're specifically spraying. But it's something that you're going to have to experiment with small fine-tune adjustments just to find that right sweet spot. And this is also where my PSI Range Finder cuts a lot of that PSI guessing game out. It shows me what range is best to start testing my PSI with the viscosity of my thinned paints. And I'll go ahead and put a link down below for you if you want one for yourself. Alright, so the next mistake is not testing. Not testing your thinned paints before you start applying it to your actual project is a big mistake. It can lead to some really frustrating surprises. Even if you think you've got the right consistency, the right PSI, it's always a good idea to do a quick test spray on a scrap piece before you dive into your main work. Testing allows you to see how your paint flows through your airbrush and how it sticks to the surface. It helps you spot issues like sputtering or uneven sprays instantly. And plus, a bigger reason, there might be some leftover cleaner or water in your airbrush from the last time you cleaned it. So if you don't do a test spray, you could end up with that residue directly on your finished model. So remember when we talked about getting the right paint consistency and the right PSI setting? This is where you confirm that everything is just right. It's much better to catch any issues on a test piece than your final project. And this is also a great way to find uses for those failed 3D prints. I keep my failed 3D prints on hand and I use those to do my test sprays on. Alright, now I do have a bonus tip for you. This tip will help keep your sanity, especially if you're using acrylics, because it's directly related to thinning your paint. Thinning your paint properly will also help minimize tip dry. Tip dry, if you don't already know, is when paint blobs build up on the needle tip and start to dry. It's a real headache, and it can happen quickly, taking many beginners by surprise. It can just ruin your artwork. Because if your paint is too thick, when the air is pushing out of the needle, it will build up quickly and potentially cause a problematic clog. The real kicker is many beginners wrongly think that they've incorrectly thinned their paint, or they have the wrong PSI. Or their airbrush is just broken. But in fact, it's really just tip dry. And that's the reason I made this video. It's all about the causes of tip dry, what it looks like, and how to minimize it. And I'll go ahead and I'll see you over in this video right here.